Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ReachX Biotech and Macro panel, and thank you for joining us. My name is Raphaël Lajeunesse. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ReachX, and for those who are less familiar with us, ReachX is headquartered in London and provides investment banking services through its tech platform and its network of senior independent finance professionals. We have more than 500 advisors working with us, and we're very thankful for their contributions. We are really in extraordinary times in terms of uncertainty and instability, and our thoughts and hearts go out to those who have been affected by this crisis, and we are happy to help in any shape and form. Today, I'm very excited to host 4 senior ReachX advisors who will discuss their views on where we are with COVID-19 and its implications on the healthcare system and the capital markets. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. We have Sarah Oelsner and Graham Schoelfield, our managing partners with Skataris, Biotech and pharma consultancy based in Berlin, focused on R&D strategy with deep scientific expertise. Skataris specializes in evaluating the risk-reward profile of assets and technologies in the biopharma space. Sarah has a PhD in immunology, and Graham has a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. Andrew Whelan is a senior healthcare corporate finance expert and elderly care specialist. He's the founder and chairman of Future Care Capital, a charity shaping thinking and practice in health and social care, and was recently advising the UK government on attracting investment to the healthcare industry, as well as leading a buying of an elderly care home group. Benoit Anne is an independent senior market strategist with a specialization in tactical asset allocation, global macro, and emerging markets. And he was previously head of public market strategy and analytics with Liberty Mutual Investments in Boston. Welcome to all of our panelists. And before we start, I would like to highlight that the views and opinions expressed by our panelists do not constitute investment advice or recommendation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please ask them via the chat button at the bottom of your screen. So I would like to start by getting the perspective from our biotech and pharma experts. And Sarah, now that the curves seem to have flattened and new information is coming in every day from the scientific community, what do we understand of COVID-19 virus 7 months after the first cases?
Yeah, thanks, Raphael. Well, in short, I have to say, certainly we don't still understand as much as we would like to understand, I guess. But I believe, as you said, over the past 6-7 months now that we've been dealing with this, we've learned quite a bit from the scientific perspective. There's a vast amount of literature really coming in every day, and it's sometimes even difficult to keep up to date on a day-to-day basis. But I think we're establishing more and more knowledge as we go. So COVID-19, as which probably everyone knows, is caused by the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, or kind of short SARS-CoV-2. And what we know and what is clear is what we understand clinically, it can come in a quite broad range of manifestations. So we see mild and self-limiting respiratory tract illnesses, which is the majority of the patients, but there's also really severe progressive respiratory disease and fatal multi-organ failure. And in fact, what we now estimate is that approximately 15 to 20% of COVID patients actually develop some kind of severe symptom, which requires hospitalization at the end of the day. And I think what's quite interesting for us to understand also, as I said, we don't understand enough yet, which is also quite important for rational drug development. But I think from that perspective, the field is getting more and more there. And what's interesting for that discussion is, from a pathobiological view, we can probably break down the disease as it progresses into 3 different stages. So you have the early infection, and this mostly manifests in throat and lung, because those are the main tissue targets that have the entry receptor expressed in a very high density, so the virus can enter quite efficiently. And so this is usually when people have quite mild symptoms, and in healthy or immune fit patients, you would get an immune response, and this would basically resolve this infection in a couple of weeks. But then basically that leads me to kind of the second stage of the disease, and that's kind of kicking in, what happens if this doesn't succeed, if the immune system can't clear this infection. And this is what I would call the kind of pulmonary phase. And this is really when the virus starts to propagate and the infection starts to destroy the alveoli in the lung. And so these are tiny sacs in the lung, and these are responsible to shuttling oxygen into the bloodstream. And as due to the damage of the virus, the cellular barrier that is dividing these sacs from blood vessels breaks down, liquids from the vessels leaks in, and it blocks the oxygen from getting into the blood. And in addition, one thing that's quite also remarkable, you see blood clotting, so really like thrombuses that really block also the bloodstream. And it's very apparent that this is when patients show this shortness of breath and hypoxia, so really low oxygen concentrations then in the blood. And from this, you would go into the third phase, I guess, of the disease, which is really remarkable, marked by so-called hyperinflammation. And so this is really when the immune response, which is usually good if it's controlled, right, overshoots. And this kind of forms a vicious circle. So patients get hyperinflammatory responses, which in turn increases the tissue damage that is already ongoing. And the tissue damage in turn, again, accelerates the inflammation. And so it's really kind of spiraling. And that's really the last stage. And when this gets really severe, what we understand now, we see that the lungs probably not possible to recover. So people die of respiratory failure, multi-organ failure, or what we don't yet understand fully, but what I think we can expect to see is that even people that survive but that have been in the severe state will see really scarred lung tissues who will have also long-term effects of that damage that's been done. So that's kind of, I think, the understanding where we are at the moment on a high level.
Understood. And do you expect to see a mutation in the virus? Can it strengthen in the coming month? And, a lot of people talk about the risk of a second wave.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from that perspective, it has kind of two angles to it. In general, like talking about a second wave and preparing for it is certainly a good idea, because we've seen how much damage this can do in several cities and countries now over the past month, right? So having a plan mapped out and preparing for a possible second wave, in any case, is a good idea from my view. I mean, I think we should look at this from first, maybe the scientific perspective, answering your question on mutation. I think when this started, some researchers in the community hoped that the virus would actually weaken over time through a series of mutation, and then it would adapt to persist in humans. And by this logic, basically the assumption was that the virus would become less deadly and have more chances to spread, inducing herd immunity at a lower cost of death. But from my current understanding, it's actually not yet found any signs that this weakening is actually happening. And in fact, what is very interesting, coronaviruses are one of the few RNA viruses with a genomic proofreading mechanism. So this actually prevents the virus from accumulating mutations. So coronaviruses are actually genomically relatively stable, so to say. So from a pure biological perspective, I think the far more likely scenario is that the virus will continue to spread and infect most of the world's population. However, and that brings me to the second point when we talk about the second wave. If we can control it and the speed this is going to spread and the impact it's going to have, this is largely controllable, but also about how we be treated as a society. So I think this will be largely determined by how we implement certain strategies, just as testing, contact tracing, isolating in a reasonable manner. And yeah, so this is really what it probably boils down to, rather than hoping that a mutation will do the job for us.
Yeah, got it. And in terms of treatment and cure, is there any companies or types of treatments that stand out at this stage?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of, there's a lot going on. Maybe basically to start this off, I think there's over 1,000 interventional clinical trials currently listed on clinicaltrials.gov. It's a lot of activity. I think we should split it up into two parts. First of all, you're speaking about cures, or basically treatment of the existing disease. And I think the second part is really a vaccine, so prophylactic approach. If we stay with the treatments for the beginning, I think the most prominent one, which is probably in everyone's mind, is Gilead's remdesivir. So this was granted emergency use authorization in the US and also got full regulatory okay in Japan, actually. This was based on a phase 3 study that was published, and it was a fairly well-run study. I think it's like 1,000 patients. It was placebo-controlled, so about half of them received active drug, and the other half was receiving the placebo. However, one thing that was quite clear was that the mortality after 14 days, which was one of the endpoints, was only slightly and not significantly improved. And it was very apparent from that study that the less severe COVID patients benefited much more from the drug than those that were actually more severely infected. So the severely ill that I was just talking about, they did not benefit, or at best marginally benefited. And in fact, this was again supported by another study that came out last week, I believe, which was, however, not placebo-controlled, but it kind of underscores the point that this is at best a treatment for quite early, not as advanced disease. And I think when we speak about it, it should be quite clear that remdesivir is not a cure. It's not even close to being a cure. And I don't think we have a cure for the disease yet. It's better than nothing. So if I had to go to hospital today, I would expect you to get it as a standard of care. But especially with advanced disease, I wouldn't expect to see any dramatic effect here. So what is quite interesting, though, from that perspective, yesterday a couple of data came out on controlling actually the inflammatory response. This is using anti-interleukin-6 antibodies. And this one actually, and this was a preprint published from the University of Michigan yesterday, and they showed a 45% lowering likelihood of death with tocilizumab, which is a drug from Roche. And this looks quite interesting. You have to see the data with a bit of skepticism, because the groups that were studied were a bit distinct. So you probably have to trim down the results a bit and see it in these slides. But I think there's certainly a benefit in these quite severe patients with anti-inflammatory approaches. And I'm guessing we'll see more on that end.
There's also been a lot of controversy surrounding the use of hydroxychloroquine, and some famous politicians and celebrities have been taking it. What's your perspective on this, given the passionate debate?
Yeah, this is a bit of getting a lengthy story now. I think after a huge study that was published, I think 2 weeks ago, with about 90,000 patients reported, it was first shown that the hydroxychloroquine actually had a higher risk of death. And so that actually led as you mentioned, the WHO to pause studies. And it was quite controversially discussed, as well as you said, politicians and actually advertised taking this drug. So now, actually yesterday, the journal where the study was published in, The Lancet, published a letter of concern, saying that the methodologies seem to be a bit off. And actually, when you look at the study, it was quite interesting. One thing to note, for example, they reported more deaths in an Australian hospital than the country actually officially reported in COVID deaths. So something just went wrong there, and there seems to be a couple of other skews in that study. And so the WHO has now resumed the study. But from my perspective, if you look at hydroxychloroquine, it's used as an antimalarial drug, and the way it's supposed to work from a mechanism of action, I think likely at best, it might be active with the very less severe patients, a bit similar to remdesivir. And we should also acknowledge that it's really known that susceptible individuals that have cardiovascular problems are also very prone to develop cardiovascular toxicities with this drug, because it's known that it's a known side effect. So this is also the patient cohort that we are targeting, because COVID patients usually, or you have a higher risk of developing severe COVID when you come with cardiovascular comorbidities. So I think just recommending it as like a preventative measurement and just taking it is frankly quite irresponsible. And I think one point maybe to make also is the prophylactic one, as we've been speaking a lot about the therapies now. So I think vaccines, what everyone is talking about, just to point out, as you mentioned, interesting companies. I think quite interesting players on the vaccine front are really these RNA platforms that we see, like Moderna, BioNTech, CureVac, and it's an interesting approach. We've been watching it for a while now in oncology more, but it's also a very interesting approach because it's very scalable, as you just need to inject the RNA into the body and then let the body produce the antigen that then stimulates immune response. So really the upside of this is, and I'm really curious to see if they can also show the respective efficacy data at the end of the day, but it would be a really interesting from making really fast, large batches. It's very scalable, it is cell-free, and it should be a process that is very really adaptable. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more data there.
Interesting. And talking about vaccine, I'd like to get your perspective, Graham. When do you think we could possibly anticipate the first vaccine to enter the market?
Thanks, Raphael and Sarah. Yeah, this is naturally a question on everyone's minds, ranging from the common public all the way to business leaders and politicians. I think firstly, it helps to take a historical view of vaccine development, and usually a vaccine takes around 4 years to get to market and is tested in thousands of patients. So they're the normal parameters for time and size. And of the vaccines tested, only about 16% actually end up making it to the market. So you get a lot of failures along the way as well. And so there's really 3 elements to the question of when we see a vaccine. It's availability of patients, the duration of the studies, number of the studies, and also their chance of success. And those are the 3 factors that come together to actually decide or come when the vaccine might actually make it to the market. So availability of patients at the moment isn't an issue. As we know, there's still around 19,000 COVID patients a day in the US. And many other countries are still grappling with exponential growth of the outbreak, such as Brazil and Russia and India. So these are very much available. Although China has shown us, if we lock down hard, how quickly the vaccine can potentially go away, assuming the numbers are accurate. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that patients will always be there, but they'll be there for the immediate term. The length of the trials is somewhat dependent on the number of patients and also on the impetus to get the trial done. So you basically need to open more centers, you need regulatory hurdles to go away or at least be lubricated or expedited, such as ethical review and things like this. And the regulators have made it very clear they're prepared to do whatever they can to get drugs which have a reasonable chance of showing some efficacy into the clinic. And so a lot of these things will be lubricated, and a lot of companies know that time is of the essence. This isn't a disease which will stay in its current form for a long time. In a couple of years, it will go away one way or the other, or at least become endemic, so it's not in a pandemic state. And so things are moving quickly. And then finally, that brings us to the chance of success. And for this, you have to demonstrate 2 things: efficacy and safety. This safety is really the key hurdle first. If a vaccine only caused 0.1% mortality or severe morbidity, if you gave this to the entire population of the major European countries or the US, which is around 300 million people apiece, you'll get about 300,000 deaths or severe morbidity. Now, at the moment, I think there's 100,000 COVID deaths. So you see that if you just have a very, very rare death from a vaccine, 1 in 1,000 patients, this can actually be more harm than good. And so this is really the key to it. So you can't really scale your trials down too small because you just simply won't see these statistically. You could easily have a trial of 2,000 patients and not see a death rate of 0.1% just by stats, just by luck, or unluckiness in this case. So this is really key. And then the other point is obviously it has to show efficacy, and this is basically its ability to mobilize the immune response. At the moment, the first pivotal trials are slated to start in the summer, probably with, as Sarah mentioned, Moderna, and probably one in the lead, but almost all of the big pharma companies and indeed many biotechs have put something forward. But the ultimate answer, this is the absolute earliest we'll see a vaccine is next summer. This assumes you get the pivotal trials started and running, you get all the patients in and the data collected by sort of January-ish next year. Then you have to analyze the data and put together submission documents, which even at best speed is going to take a month or two. Then the FDA has to go through it and approve it. And yeah, at best speed, they'll probably do this in a month or two rather than the usual 9 months, 6 to 9 months. So yeah, best time speed is the summer next year. And that doesn't even cover the manufacturing wildcard, which, as Sarah mentioned, is a favor for the RNA viruses, but many drugs have failed because they failed to clear the manufacturing hurdle. You're injecting this stuff inside you, so if it's not reproducibly safe from a manufacturing point of view, you don't have impurities and batch-to-batch variation, then it'll get quelled before it even gets looked at.
So looking at the timeline for vaccine and the difficulty to treat the disease, does it mean that the lockdown was really the most effective cure, so, quote unquote? Do you think it was the right approach?
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of it's best to think of this question as a scenario-based question, because we're obviously in one scenario of the world now, but there was another scenario where we didn't do the lockdown. And really the answer to this question essentially is dependent on the number of true infections. So this is the symptomatic infections and the asymptomatic infections. So almost all of the documented cases at the moment are symptomatic infections. These are patients with symptoms ranging from mild coughing, etc., up until what Sarah described, and ultimately death. And these are what we documented. What the asymptomatic infections are is when you have something incredibly mild where it doesn't even really affect you, and where you have it maybe for a week or two, but you don't even register it, so you don't even get tested or anything like this. Several studies obviously have looked at this because this is an incredibly important thing to understand, and really the asymptomatic rate has varied from anywhere between 90% of infections being asymptomatic down to 20 or 30. And it really depends on the study and the location, and we really don't have a good handle on that yet. If we take it as a 90% case, this means if we had, at the minute there's 2 million documented infections, this would mean 20 million people have been infected. This will put the death rate well below 1 and actually in the range of the common flu. And then you can make an argument when you set this against the damage from the lockdown, both economic and human, including the rise in suicides and domestic violence and things. You could bring it into question as an argument, right, with hindsight. However, if you have an asymptomatic rate in the 50% range, and this will put the death rate overall in the 2 to 5% range, it's a very different ballgame, because this is a very high death rate. And to put it in perspective, World War II killed 3% of the world's population. So you're looking at the same death rate as a global war. So, when this decision had to be made, which was really, really early, and frankly, the Western society countries mostly should have made it earlier, we had very little data around this. And the only responsible thing was initiate a lockdown. It would have been incredibly irresponsible to risk the deaths of millions on the off chance the death rate is low. And I think this is very clear. Now the challenge will be lifting this lockdown responsibly, both from a political perspective and also from an individual perspective, to minimize COVID infection spikes, to try and prevent that second wave, which already has started in countries like Iran, and trying to at the same time balance the downsides of the economic restrictions, which are damaging, there's no doubt about that, and they are going to cause loss of life one way or the other, directly or indirectly. There's likely going to be no right answer to this, and with hindsight, we might get some 2020 vision on it, but probably not, to be honest. So it's going to be a fine balancing act going forward doing this, and it will be as much politically driven and as scientific driven, I imagine.
Thanks, Graham. Now turning to Andrew, you are an expert on the healthcare system, and in particular in the healthcare system in the UK. And it seems that from the numbers we got, that the UK was quite strongly affected by the virus. So how well prepared was the system, and how well was organized the response for COVID-19 in the UK? You think?
Yeah, so as I say, I'm going to focus on the UK because I know that a bit better. But the short answer is not very. But it's very easy to look back in hindsight and talk about all the things that one could have done. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think some are structurally the way the UK system is set up, and a number of things are culturally. So the first thing is the UK is basically two parallel systems. We have a healthcare system and we have a social care system. And within both of those, there are multiple regulators, government departments, commissioners, and providers of care. So, for example, there are around 200 NHS commissioners. There are a similar number of local authorities who commission social care, and there are various stacks of regulators, and they all work within their various pieces. Culturally, the UK is very focused on the NHS, which deals with the acute side of care, and so the culture is always towards treatment rather than prevention, and it's always about dealing with what's visible and acute rather than dealing with what might come. So that has various effects. So whilst there are bodies like Public Health England who are established to look at prevention and to look at dealing with scenarios around pandemics, and people have known that there's been a pandemic or been expecting a pandemic and have been running scenarios for some time. When it comes to funding and political decisions, money is always shifted towards what is visible and acute, which tends to be the NHS. So that's the background in which the government were sort of were working. The second thing is the UK hasn't experienced anything like this before. So the first SARS had a very limited effect in the UK. There was, and therefore we didn't have the systems in place that, for example, some of the China and some of the Eastern countries had, who were heavily affected by SARS a decade or so ago. So the preparedness wasn't there. I think, as Graham alluded to, the decision to lock down is a very, very difficult political one to make, and arguably, and in hindsight, could have been made earlier. And I'm sure as the politics rolls out of this, there will be sides saying it should have been. But I'm very glad I'm not in the position of the politicians having to take a broader picture of the economy and everything else that's going on. And make some very difficult decisions. But it does seem to have had an effect, and I think the challenge now that governments face is a message of stay at home is very simple, and more nuanced message of there are certain circumstances when you can do certain things but you mustn't do this and you can do that becomes very difficult to understand, particularly in an environment where people still don't have good data sets, and the science is open to a lot of interpretation and opinions. So science isn't, it doesn't give a direct path. It is, it creates data for discussion.
What lessons can we learn from this crisis in terms of what to do next for the healthcare system?
Yeah, so in the UK, I mean, some good things came out of this. As I mentioned, the sort of the two systems of health and social care for decades, people have been talking about the fact that the two need to be integrated, and there have been numerous projects to do that, and there continue to have been difficulties. So, for example, one of the biggest problems that the UK has is bed blockers, or what are called bed blockers. So these are people who are medically fit to be discharged from hospital. They tend to be the elderly, because they need some support with their activities of daily living in the community, and because that is dealt with by a different function by the local authorities. They're stuck in a medical bed that they don't need to be in, because they haven't got a package of care to look after them in their own home or in a care home or somewhere out in the community. And that has a cascading effect down the system, because if your beds are blocked at the exit, you can't bring people in who need the acute care and who need elective surgery and so on. But when COVID hit, all the system galvanised around the common enemy. And suddenly the local authorities and the regulators and the care providers and the commissioners began working together to get people out of hospital beds, to free up the intensive care capacity and indeed build new capacity. Within 3 weeks, the Nightingale hospitals built at the Excel Centre in London added another 4,000 intensive care beds, which thankfully didn't need to be used because of the lockdown, but might have been in other scenarios. So I think in terms of lessons, the second point I should say that's always been a contentious one is use of technology, and because people were unable to visit their GPs, suddenly GPs began using Zoom and other technologies to do virtual consultations, and this has been around for a long time, but this has been resisted. I suspect there's a balance. It's sort of the 80-20 rule went from 20% virtual consultations to 80% virtual consultations, and there's still a lot of general practice and consultations that need to be done on site. But people have begun to embrace technology. I think if there's lessons to be learned, is that we can do it, and we need to make sure we don't go backwards to what it used to be like, but actually come back to a more sensible equilibrium where we're using the technology, where the parts of the system are working well together for the benefit of the patients and the benefit of the people who are in need of care.
Understood. And how do you think it's going to affect the health policies and the healthcare investment going forward?
So the fundamentals haven't really changed. We still, all the issues we have, particularly with long-term care, are still there. We have an aging population. The wealth is not distributed fairly across the population. There's the questions around how you pay for care. I think from a policy perspective, the way my experience of the way governments tend to work is policy follows what is being done, so it doesn't really lead. It focuses on what's visible and acute, and when things become visible and acute and the electorate wants something to be done about it, then that's when policy moves in. And what the crisis has done is it's shone a spotlight on other areas of health and care that we haven't really seen before. So focus has always been on the NHS and acute healthcare. But now people are getting a better understanding of what social care does. They're having a better understanding of mental health and the importance of that within the system. And slowly, as people begin to learn about these other areas, long-term care, care in the community, and mental health, and so on, it becomes more visible. And then that is when there become more opportunities and more funding and policy moves around it. So it's not necessarily a change in policy, it's more a shift in mindset, and I think that's beginning to happen. In terms of investments, I don't think anything's going to happen in the short term that's going to change. I think the fundamentals are the same. So I don't think there are going to be any dramatic shifts of we need to put more funding into elderly care beyond what was already being talked about beforehand, or we're going to need to put a whole load of funding into mental health. These things have been talked about for a long time, but policy isn't catching up. So I don't think there are fundamental shifts that are going to happen in the short term. There are some practical issues around investments in the short term. There are the ability to close deals, for example. Difficult to do due diligence, difficult to visit care homes, difficult to meet management teams with lockdown restrictions other than virtually. So the process that investors go through of building rapport and really getting underneath the skin becomes more challenging. I think that those deals that have been in the pipeline have had paused, but are coming back again. I think there is potentially a bigger pool of investors who are looking at the sector, more generalists coming in, and that is good and bad depending on the view you take. If you're on the sell side, there's potentially more people you can sell to, and there's potentially the generalists who understand the nuances of the healthcare sector may be inclined to pay more, which may or may not be good for the sector in the long term. And that's just driven by the fact that there are funds available and there is a scarcity of other assets, assets like hospitality or travel or whatever else are unlikely to be invested in versus healthcare. So I think it depends on a case by case basis, but I don't see that the fundamentals are changing. There just may be a little change in the way people work for the foreseeable future.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm now going to turn to Benoit. So, Benoit, we heard from Scataris that a vaccine is not around the corner, and presumably the lockdown has worked in some countries, but there's still a lot of risks. And the reality is that the economic damage is quite substantial, and yet the markets have performed extraordinarily well. I think we're 8% from the S&P 500 record. So how do you explain this disconnect?
Well, thanks. So looking, of course, which is an easy job, I can see why the market has performed so well, basically since the third week of March. First factor, of course, the Fed policy bazooka, fantastic boost to investor confidence. Really, the Fed was the game changer there. Then followed the second factor, the big fiscal programs we saw around the world, in the EU and then the US with a multiple trillion package. That was also a big signal for investors. And then I think investors really got enthused with prospects of cure or prospects of vaccine, a lot of noise that has boosted investor sentiment. So looking back, yeah, fantastic rebound. But I'm sure you're going to ask me what next, because that's really the key question.
Yeah. So what's your outlook? I mean, obviously you seem a little bit skeptical of this rally. So what do you expect, and how bearish are you, I guess?
It's very fashionable to talk about letters these days. I think the market is simply priced for perfection and fully pricing in a V-shaped recovery. So my near-term outlook is not going to be a V, it's going to be an inverted V. Near term, I think the momentum takes the market a bit higher, but I'm struggling to see that market rally being sustained, and I expect a correction coming through sometime in the near future. In fact, we're probably entering a critical phase right now, because from the data perspective and from that disconnect you were talking about earlier, Raphael, we're going to watch the data in May and in June, and that's going to come in, let's say, July. So next month, we're going to see those data coming in. And if there's any evidence that we're not in a V-shaped territory, well, the market is going to react.
But just to follow up on this a little bit, I mean, if you go into lockdown and you shut down shops and industrial sites, in a way, it's not surprising if you start reopening, you should see a very sharp recovery. So
well, that's what the enthusiastic investors are thinking about. But the problem is, what happens to the structural factors? It gets a bit more complicated when you see a flow of bankruptcies, defaults, unemployment, of course, is also a major problem. So there might be persisting effects that might get in the way of that V-shaped recovery, and that's why I'm a bit nervous.
Yeah, and we know that a second wave, while some countries are preparing for it, it's still quite speculative. Do you think the market is pricing it into the risky assets?
Yeah, so clearly not. I mean, that second wave would be, I think, a disaster for investors. As I said earlier, the market is really pricing for perfect V-shaped and for perfect miracle on on the virus front, be a vaccine or some miracle or the cure. So from that perspective, the balance of risks is skewed to the downside, and there's clearly disappointment risk there. And I think the second wave is probably the biggest risk for the market from that perspective.
And if you have this view, so how would you play the market? How would you position yourself? Would you do it through volatility, through other instruments?
So volatility is going to go up, in my view, because it's been suppressed by the strong central bank action. And I think it's probably too low, doesn't really reflect the underlying risk there. I would say the momentum is there. Okay, so there's a theme that says, don't fight the Fed for now, but I would turn definitely cautious or more negative on risky assets within a month or two. And then I would look at relative value. My valuation framework shows that there's still some pockets of value out there, especially on the emerging market side, which have been neglected and got bad press, but there's still some value there. Whereas if you look at US credit, well, there's no value left. We're at fair value, which is not an entry point in my view, especially in IG.
Got it. And we talked about it just briefly that, one never fights the Fed, but what do you think overall of the overall policy response, right? Governments and central banks. And do you think they can win?
So I'm very positive about that, to the extent that at least the Fed helped market function again. If you remember, in March, the markets froze. It was a total breakdown of the market process, and that was a severe threat. It was a collapse of investor sentiment. It was a massive volatility spike, and that was very toxic. At least the Fed took care of that. I take that as a massive positive. I don't think we're going to see that again because of the Fed action. That was very strong. On the fiscal side, I'm skeptical about whether those packages are going to really cushion the shocks. The macro shocks are extremely severe, and however big those packages have been, I'm still concerned about the damage to the growth landscape. And we're going to see that over the coming weeks, and that's why I'm very cautious on that market from that market outlook perspective.
So what's the new normal for you? Is that the new normal, bankruptcies and economic trouble?
Yeah, we're going to see that coming through. Yes, you're right. There's still very little visibility about the sustaining shock, whether the new behaviors are going to kick in or not on the consumer front, on so many factors. I'm not an expert in real estate, but it looks like the working from home might have some behavior impact on that sector, on commercial real estate perhaps. The behavior in terms of the consumer, what about tourism? And then there are also a bunch of structural issues that we haven't really sorted out yet. Global trade, what happens to the future of global trade in the face of this big push for deglobalization? Looks like the tensions between the US and China are re-emerging again, and that's a big risk for global growth. Protectionism, which is part of it, the collapse of global policy coordination efforts. So many big risks that are going to shape that new normal, and that doesn't really make me very positive on the medium to long term here.
Thanks, Benoit. I'm just going to open the Q&A for the audience. If you have any questions, please post your question on pressing on the chat button, and we'll share the questions with our panel. So either for the Skitaris team or Andrew or Benoit. So a few questions, for the Skitaris team. Can a vaccine really work, and how long will it take to manufacture?
Perhaps I'll go with, can a vaccine really work? Yes, in short. So we have vaccines for several RNA viruses. The most noticeable, or the poster child, I think, is probably the polio virus. where we've actually eradicated or society's eradicated 2 out of the 3 strains on the planet. So vaccines are actually the most successful drug class in the history of pharma. It can't be understated how good they are. It can't be understated how much benefit they brought to society. So that's an unequivocal yes. There's very few viruses we can't successfully vaccinate. And there's no reason to believe this for coronavirus is in that class of viruses. Yes, unequivocal yes. Can it be manufactured? Again, this is an unequivocal yes. We've manufactured many vaccines, ranging from RNA, which are more experimental, up until more attenuated virus vaccines, which is essentially you boil the virus and add an adjuvant, although I'm oversimplifying it. It's essentially what it is. And then you have recombinant vaccines where you produce the protein in a bacteria and then give that with an adjuvant. But all of those are fairly standard processes in the grand scheme of things. And so it can be done, no problem. The question more about is how quickly you can do it.
Thanks, Graham. Question for Andrew. Can the health system in the UK afford the changes to have more preventive medicine?
Can it afford the changes for more preventive medicine? I'd put the question the other way around: is how can it not afford the changes? I think it's a question is around. It's again it's back to the point around mindset and where does the funding need to go, and a lot of it is it's very easy to measure data of number of people visiting hospitals, how long they stay in there, how quickly they are cured, how they come out, and it's far more complicated to measure all the people who never went into hospital in the first place because they were well. But I think that's a mindset and a political choice of focusing as building a system that is far more focused on prevention than it is on cure. And actually, it is. The far more funding already goes on that. But the talk is always about the cure rather than the prevention. And I think it's changing that slight nuance in the conversation, and people understand that there is already significant investment in well-being and managing and prevention and so on.
Thank you. And then a question on the macro side, Benoit. What is your view on sovereign risks? It seems to be a non-topic versus 2008.
Yeah, so I would make the distinction between emerging markets and developed markets here. I think there's much more tolerance for debt at this point, simply because the leverage picture overall, I think is a bit better. The starting point was also better. Earlier this year, we were actually on very strong footing. So I'm not overly concerned about sovereign risk, except for, obviously, there are always exceptions. In Europe, I think the usual suspects, Italy, have to be watched. In emerging markets, I think there's value there. Sovereign debt in emerging markets has cheapened, has not really caught back up as much as developed market. So there's a bit of a relative value opportunity on that front. But again, pick and choose, because there are countries in emerging markets that I would want to avoid as well.
Thank you. And we got another question from the audience on, can we see another second wave within a month, given the lockdown has been relaxed? And I assume we're talking about the UK and continental Europe. I know, Sarah, you talked about that, but how do you think about this when now we're reopening everywhere?
Yeah, I think again, since it was a point I stressed, I don't think we can rely on the biology in that term. So we'll come down a lot to how we as a society deal with it and can implement the testing and procedures to really keep it under control to a certain degree. I'm also seeing the question about the third wave coinciding with the usual winter flu. That's an interesting one because there's certainly viral diseases that are seasonal, However, there's actually no evidence for the SARS-CoV-2 for that to be the case. And a very recent study from University of Toronto, they actually tested that. First, they said there was some temperature impact, but actually in a larger cohort, they showed there was no impact of like temperature increase or also pressure. So I don't think we can rely on this kind of concept of thinking, you know, in summer it will all go away and disappear. So it really comes more down to how we implement testing procedures, tracking and isolating patients in a sufficient manner that is also reasonable to implement on a society basis.
Thanks, Sarah. Then question on Europe for you, Benoit. I'm going to lump the two questions into one. Is, you know, the impact of COVID on the Brexit negotiation, and can we see another Euro crisis?
Yeah. So first on Brexit, it has taken a bit of a back foot clearly on the radar of the UK government. So it doesn't seem that things are going that well, which I think may compound the challenges for the UK. So I'm not very positive on that front. You have to see a big turnaround in focus on the part of the government for things to improve. On the Euro side, well, I think the financial stability risks have been beautifully taken care of by the ECB. We heard about that today again with an extension of the stimulus there. But I'm concerned about the odd cases in Europe, in particular Italy, where there could be trouble brewing just because the debt sustainability numbers in that case don't really work that well. So it's ultimately, I would say the chance of a crisis in Europe is less than 50%, simply because of the institutional backdrop. We're going to avoid a crisis at all cost. But there's that's a fat tail risk, I would call that, especially for Italy, and it's a source of risk for the market.
Thanks, Benoit. Another question for you, Benoit. You mentioned that maybe you should avoid some of the EM countries, some of them at least, and you're more positive on others. Can you give us a bit of a view also on why and which ones, and then which developed markets you would avoid in particular?
Mm-hmm. So I care a lot about policy credibility. I actually spent some time at the IMF many years ago. So credibility of the economic policy framework is I think absolutely critical in my view. So any emerging markets that has a weak policy credibility needs to be avoided. And worst case scenario is any country that has a history of default should be avoided as well. So that puts us with Argentina, Ukraine, Turkey. I think Brazil used to be a credible policy framework case, but more recently it slipped to the watch list, I guess. So there are some question marks there. I'm much more constructive on Mexico, relatively speaking, and obviously a number of countries in Asia are doing the right thing, and Central Europe. So it's you have to be selective, I'm afraid. Developed markets depends on whether we talk fixed income or equities. In equities, the US market has rallied so hard that I would argue there's a chance for Europe to catch up. You were mentioning earlier, Raphael, the US is 8% below its peak year to date, while Europe is 15%, so a bit of catching up there. In fixed income, it's the opposite. If you look at the value, US fixed income, especially high yield, is much cheaper than EU fixed income, Euro high yield fixed income. simply because euro was overvalued to start with, even before the crisis.
Thanks, Benoit. I don't think there's any more questions, so I think I'd like to move to the conclusions. And if that's okay, I'd like to hear each one of you and tell me a little bit what you are looking at for the next 3 to 6 months, and what do you expect and what do you focus on. And I know that it's quite difficult, obviously, in this uncertain times to think about that, but obviously you're subject matter experts, so it'd be great to get your view. Maybe Sarah, you want to tell us what you look at or what you think about for the next 3 to 6 months, and then I'll ask the other panelists.
Sure, thanks, Raphael. So I think there are a couple of points here which I also found very interesting in the discussion. So from my perspective, I think what is certainly interesting is I think we'll see a boost with this crisis actually for novel drug platforms now being able to actually move potentially quicker than initially thought into a clinical development. There's a lot going on, as I said. We will constantly expand in building knowledge around the disease and also potential treatment options, investments on that side, and also despite the mentioned difficulties in conducting due diligence work, etc., I think will still not be a large barrier. I think about 160 partnerships have been closed already on developing COVID drugs, and I'm quite hopeful that at least in the biotech sector, this will go also. These collaborations and partnerships we see go beyond development of COVID potentially. So I think that's definitely something that will boost a couple of quite interesting platforms. However, I think on the other side, there's a lot caution to be taken. As I mentioned, there's a lot of data coming out every day that is really to be read with with a lot of caution. Some approaches that are jumping very fast into the clinic now are really highly questionable whether conceptually they, even with our weak scientific understanding, whether they would actually work. So there's also a lot of very, very, I'd say almost fishy stuff, frankly, out there. So you just gotta be mindful when you think about that. And as Benoit mentioned, like the market is looking for basically the miracle drug to come. And if you ask my opinion, I think it's very unlikely for us to see that within the next 3 to 6 months. And that's just because we have so limited also understanding of the baseline thing that we're treating. Same holds true for the vaccine, as Graham already alluded to. But I'm quite excited actually to see the, as I mentioned, the RNA vaccine data and how this will play out. So I'm definitely looking forward to how that field is moving and seeing that mature. Thanks,
Sarah. Graham, any thoughts for the?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps perhaps a little bit of a new topic. So the one thing that has happened a lot in pharma at the moment is the delay of clinical trials. And this is because patients can't make it to clinical trials, like non-COVID clinical trials. And this is because patients can't make it to centers. They're not going to follow-ups because of fear of COVID. They don't want to go to hospital. You know, there's many, many aspects of this. This is causing two effects. One is a delay in recruitment for trials, obviously. But the other thing is it's actually damaging trial integrity. And this is because you don't get the patient follow-ups, you actually lose your data point. And this means that you end up with trials being potentially underpowered. And that way you get more false negative trial results. So drugs that do work, but the trials rolled out negative because of this effect. And so I'm quite interested and keen from especially from investors' point of view and also from supporting clients in trying to understand this effect and how it's going to affect the market, the clinical trial dynamics over the coming 6 months or so, which are the trials that are most likely to be impacted from this we're reading out in the next 6 months, 12 months. The FDA has already shown some willingness to move on this, which is basically unheard of. Changing a stats plan mid-trial is pretty hard in most cases. It's also, this will be very interesting. It's kind of unprecedented. And this could affect a multitude of companies in ways we don't expect.
Thanks, Graham. Andrew, any thoughts for Sean?
Yeah, so quickly, I think, you know, on my side of things, the healthcare services side of things, COVID has put a pause to transactions, but people are looking to bring them back. As you know, personally, as you mentioned, I was leading a buy-in, and we got to, I was going to say 11th hour, but it's more like 11:59 because we were on the verge of completing when COVID hit, and the vendor decided not to sell. Her view was that valuations had gone up because it would be better for the sector, and we weren't prepared to change our price. But actually, it's unlikely that any of those transactions will complete in the next 3 to 6 months. So personally, I'm exploring supporting the sell side, going in ahead of a transaction to lead an MBO rather than an MBI, because we're seeing a lot of investors come into the sector, and a lot of investors haven't come here before. I think the important thing to say, though, is that there are a lot of opportunities within health and social care, but as ever, there are good, there's some indifferent, and there are some bad, and so it's important to really get some good advice and look at the right, make sure you understand the sector properly before investing in it, so you can find those gems. But that's what I think in the next 3 to 6 months there will be a pipeline building up that will then start to unravel in the next year or so.
Thank you, Andrew. And Benoit, what are the things you're going to look at with attention in the next few months?
Well, evidence of whether we are going to experience that so-called V-shaped recovery or not. And we're going to find out soon. The data will start creeping in next month. And if we don't get that, well, there's going to be trouble coming for the market, because again, the market is really pricing in that the ideal scenario of a V-shaped recovery and some miracle somehow coming from the medical side.
Thanks a lot. And thank you to all of you for your participation. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Graham, Andrew, and Benoit for sharing your thoughts today. Thanks to all of you who have been able to attend our webinar, and we hope it has provided you with helpful insights into the current situation. We'll be back in a few weeks with a new webinar. And if you have any questions, or if you want to get in touch with our speakers, please feel free to send us an email at info@reachx.co, or myself, rsl@reachx.co. The webinar is recorded and will be available online on our website in a few days. So many thanks again, and have a great end of week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.